Professor Indiratna, Dr. Vidal Patra, Reverend Dr. Professor, Dr. Vijaywarna, Dr. Terry, distinguished invitees, fellow members of the Sri Lanka Economists Association. First and foremost, let me thank the President and Council of the SLEA for inviting me to be here with you. As Upananda pointed out, I've been a part of this body for many years. My level of engagement has varied from time to time, but I've certainly been very proud to be a member of this, the premier professional association for economists in this country. Again, I must also thank the Council for inviting me to be here with you and to speak to you this evening. And as previous speakers have said, this is a very timely and important theme for the country. In many ways, it's probably the most important challenge that we have to confront and overcome. And in my remarks this evening, I intend to divide it up into three. Initially, to have a diagnostic set of remarks, trying to analyze the contours of the fiscal challenge that the country faces. Then to speak a little bit about remedial measures that are in the pipeline. And finally, of course, fiscal consolidation is a very necessary condition, but it's not sufficient because we need to address the supply side as well. So the measures that we introduce to get our fiscal house in order have to be supported by growth and employment generating supply side policies as well. Otherwise, you get trapped in a low investment, a low growth, high unemployment syndrome. So those are the three kind of segments that I'd like to address this evening. Let me first talk a little bit about the kind of stop-go cycle. In fact, Dr. Vijaywarna's, one of his slides kind of demonstrated that very vividly. I mean, there is no doubt that the budget deficit has been the main source of instability in the system. If you look at the period after 1978, right through that period, and as he pointed out, really the peaks in growth, if you look at it, it's strongly correlated to years when there was high budget deficits. So the growth process in Sri Lanka is driven, has been driven very much by the size of the budget deficit, by the excess demand that has been pumped into the system. Now if you contrast that with the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia, their growth was driven by surpluses in the current account of the balance of payments. So there is a qualitative difference, which is why their growth was sustainable and ours was not, because the economy overheats very quickly when you drive it with the excess demand coming out of the budget deficit. Now, you know, not only is the excess demand coming out of the budget deficit a problem in terms of having these repeating cycles of stop-go policies, but it's also anti-poor. It's anti-poor in two ways. Because on the one hand, you have high inflation. And inflation is an extremely regressive implicit tax on the poor. The rich have assets which gain value during inflationary periods, which act as a hedge against inflation, but the poor don't have assets. So when you run a budget deficit, on the one hand, the excess demand pumps up inflation, and that is anti-poor. And also at the same time, the corrective measures that are taken, once the economy overheats, and you have problems on the inflation front and on the balance of payment problem, the stabilization program that you implement also disproportionately affects the poor. So it's really double jeopardy for them. They get hit by the higher inflation, and then you have the adjustment, and the adjustment also affects the poor disproportionately. So the budget deficit is, in terms of macroeconomic fundamentals, a problem, but it also is a anti-poor. Often people think that austerity measures are anti-poor, but in many ways the expansionary fiscal policies which are unsustainable, in my view, are actually even more anti-poor. Now, another kind of way of looking at the fiscal problems that we've had over the last 30, 40 years is if you caricaturize the Sri Lankan economy in the post-1978 era, you could caricaturize it as a high budget deficit, high inflation, high nominal interest rate, because if inflation is high, you have to have high nominal interest rate, and an overvalued currency economy, because once there is a high inflation differential between ourselves and our major competitors and trading partners, the exchange rate comes under pressure. You lose competitiveness. But we have a very high import component in our basic consumption bundle. So to run a competitive exchange rate policy has always been politically difficult. So our exchange rate has tended to be overvalued. So you have high inflation, high nominal interest rates, and an overvalued currency for much of the time in the last 30, 40 years. Now that is diametrically the opposite, 180 degrees the opposite of the way you would caricaturize the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia. They ran very tight budgets, and they therefore had low inflation, therefore they were able to have low nominal interest rates, and they were able to have competitive, undervalued often, and stable exchange rates. So really, that is again an interesting way of looking at this problem in the way how the fiscal deficit has really constrained the efforts to achieve sustained growth in the Sri Lankan economy. And it's interesting that, since 1987, the current account of the budget has been in deficit in every single year. So we've borrowed for recurrent expenditure as well as for all the capital expenditure. Now, borrowing for capital expenditure, provided it's good quality investment, is fine. But to borrow year after year for your recurrent expenditure, I mean, you think about your own household or a small shop even, that is a pretty, usually a very suicidal way of running your affairs. So then one asks the question, how was it that we were able to get away with it? How were we able to get away with having these profligate fiscal policies year after year since 1987? And there, the answer is that we were a donor darling. We got up to about 5% of GDP as highly concessional money. So that really meant that we were able to get away from the tough decisions that we had to make. So, I think the traditional donors were well intentioned. They wanted to demonstrate good development outcomes in a country with liberal economic policies after 77, 78, and a fairly open pluralist polity. So they were extremely generous and gave us the money. We were able to live beyond our means and not really impose the kind of discipline that we had to do. But then we graduated. We graduated into low middle income country status, and over the years now, in the last 4 or 5 years, we have had access to less and less concessional money. And we have now exposed to the discipline, the harsh discipline imposed by rating agencies and international capital markets. So we are in a new paradigm, and I hope we are beginning to get the message, because if we don't, as Dr. Vijayawardena warned and has warned many times over in his articles and his talks, we are on a trajectory which will take us to a very dangerous place. So we need to understand we can't have business as usual. We can't live beyond our means, because in the old days we got about 5% of GDP as foreign aid. I think about 60-65% used to come from the concessional windows of the ADB and the World Bank. We are talking about 10-year grace periods, 40-50-year maturity, less than 1% administration charge. And then another kind of, the rest of it came as bilateral aid, again on extremely concessional terms. Today, quite a lot of the external financing is coming at about 6% from international capital markets. It's a completely different ballgame. So unless we have a change in mindset in terms of the way we conduct our fiscal policy, we will be in serious trouble. Now, in terms of trying to understand the kind of contours of the fiscal challenge that we faced over the years, let me take a quick kind of historical thumbnail sketch of fiscal trends in the country. Now, at independence, much of the revenue came from taxing the export tree crop sectors, the tea, rubber, coconut sectors, which were generating large surpluses at that time. And of course, the Korean War boom, shortly after independence, was particularly helpful. But then, from the mid to late 50s onwards, there was a secular and dramatic decline in the prices of our tree crop export commodities, and that began to put pressure on our revenue. At the same time, right from independence, one has seen the emergence of a pretty toxic combination of populist politics on the one hand and an entitlement culture among our people. And the two were mutually reinforcing, and that combination has exerted pressure on the expenditure side right through. So on the one hand, you are beginning to see revenue come down, and on the other hand, you are beginning to see expenditure go up. And of course, the problem was compounded by the fact that we had a demographic surge in the sort of 60s, really from the mid to late 50s onwards through 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. So when you bring all this together, there was a kind of a non-virtuous set of circumstances which placed a lot of pressure on the government's fiscal operations. Now, I would say that in the years up to sort of, I would say up to maybe even just 7-8 years ago, expenditure was more of a problem than revenue. Because as Dr. Vijaywarna pointed out, our revenue was about 22% of GDP in the 1980s, which actually was a pretty reasonable number when you compare it with countries at a similar level of development. At that time, the problem was expenditure. But in the last 7-8 years, there has been a qualitative transformation in the way the fiscal situation has deteriorated. Because today the problem is revenue. Expenditure, which is at about 20% of GDP, 19% of GDP, is actually not such a bad number when you look at our peer countries. And in fact, Dr. Vijaywarna was pointing out that revenue should go up to about 19. So in fact, revenue of about 22 even, we would give it a 3% budget deficit. So on the expenditure side, actually there is a bit of scope to go up a bit even. And that would help us to accommodate more of the health and education expenditure, etc., which we need going forward. The expenditure to look after an aging population, all these things, challenges need to be met. But on the revenue side, Professor Mick Moore, who was here a few months ago, in a presentation, or in a couple of presentations he made here, pointed out that Sri Lanka probably has a world record for the collapse of revenue. I think if I get the numbers right, it fell from over 20% to about 11.4% in 2014. It has gone up to 13% last year, and maybe a little bit more this year as well. Now the corresponding figure for comparator countries, so we have been at 13, down as low as 11.4%, and now up to about 13%. The corresponding figure for comparator countries are Malaysia 22.2%, Philippines 19.4%, and Thailand 22.6%. Now if you look at the expenditure side, Malaysia is 25.3%, against a revenue of 22.2%. So they have a budget deficit of about 3% of GDP. Philippines 19.4% for both revenue and expenditure, and Thailand 22.6% for revenue and 22.3%. So they have a small surplus. These are all numbers for 2015. So it just shows you how comparator countries who are a bit ahead of us, but that's the kind of scenario we need to get to, where we have, I personally don't feel we need to have a balance in the budget, but certainly we should get our deficit down to 3.5%, which is the target for 2020. Now, it may be, let me next try to understand the reasons for the deterioration in this revenue. Why did we have this collapse in revenue? And there, one, of course, the historical, if you go back, is the collapse in the prices of our tree crop-based revenue. That came down, and we have never really found a substitute because the new growth sectors, for instance, like apparel, like tourism, and now IT, are all tax exempt. They're not paying taxes. And the non-tradable growth sectors like construction, like transport, there are fairly challenging tax administration issues in terms of revenue collection. So this is one of the reasons why you see this erosion in revenue. And not only that, and Etteri in her remarks pointed out the number of exemptions that we have. And again, one asks the question, why is it that it became necessary for us to hand out all these exemptions? I mean, part of it is, of course, lobbying by special interest groups, but I think it goes beyond that as well. Because one, throughout the conflict, there was a high war risk premium attached to the economy. So to get projects over the hurdle rate of return, one had to give some concessions. Then equally, our infrastructure has improved, but was a problem in previous years. We've had high electricity costs, and on top of that, we've had these weak macroeconomic fundamentals with high interest rates and often an overvalued exchange rate. So when you take all that together, to get investment going, you had to give a lot of exemptions. Otherwise, the rates of return on the projects are not going to get over the hurdle rate of return. So there had to be giveaways. But now if you look at each of those, there is no war risk premium on the economy. I hope we are on the way to getting better macroeconomic fundamentals, and over time we can bring interest rates down and run a more competitive exchange rate. Electricity costs still relatively high, but there are signs that we can get it down. They have come down a little, in fact, already. And the infrastructure is improving, so transaction costs in the economy are also coming down. So given, if you take all that together, the rationale for giving away these exemptions have gone, and the government, in fact, is, I think, in this budget, will address that. Let me now talk a little bit about the debt dynamics, which all the previous speakers spoke vividly about, particularly Dr. Vijay Wadna. Our debt is 76% of GDP, the debt stock. Now, again, the same comparator countries, Malaysia 57.4, Philippines 31.7, and Thailand 43.1. And you must remember that particularly Malaysia and Thailand have far greater capacity to service debt. Their export performance is significantly, exponentially better than ours. Despite that, their debt stock as a percent of GDP is 20% or more less. So that shows how vulnerable we are in terms of our debt dynamics. And on top of that, if you look at our rating peers, the median is somewhere around 40%. So we are a complete outlier when it comes to debt as a percent of GDP. And as Dr. Vijay pointed out, revenue is now over 90, almost 100. Debt servicing is almost now 100% of GDP, or over 90% anyway. So as he said, we are borrowing. Basically, we are borrowing for all our expenditure. And that's not a very resilient situation to be in. And we have a deficit, a primary deficit as well. And what that really means is you have no cushion. You can't have counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Now, people Terry talked about the new mediocrity, that the global economy has slow growth, sluggish international trade. But we don't have any ammunition, no policy space to compensate for that by boosting domestic demand. In fact, at a time when the world economy is going through this new mediocrity, we are having to compress domestic absorption. So, if you get yourself into this kind of mess, you really give away a lot of important policy levers which give you the chance to have counter-cyclical policies. Now, there's also, this challenge we have to build up non-borrowed reserves. It's one thing to have a high debt. Japan has a massive debt to GDP ratio, but they're able to finance it partly because they have very high savings rates, and they have the capacity their reserves are enormous. Our reserves are, a lot of it is borrowed. We're vulnerable again on the reserve side. But central bank governors, when they talk about reserve vulnerability, need to have also a positive story. So let me also have a positive narrative side by side, and that is that I think we are about to get some relief, some space for liability management. The government has come close to concluding a deal to sell Hamamatala port. Basically, 80% owners, Chinese party, I don't know that I'm allowed to tell the name, so I won't say that, but anyway, a Chinese company has bought 80% of Hamamatala harbour, and that is basically going to lead to an infusion of about $1 billion. Now, why this is particularly attractive is it's non-debt creating, because it's not really a debt equity swap. They're basically buying the port, and we will service the debt, but we don't have to serve it all in one go. And it's non-debt creating FDI, but it's FDI to buy an already built asset. Because normally when FDI comes in, Koilorani goes out in terms of the, they have to import the capital goods, etc. This money is going to come and sit in our reserves. And a similar operation is also underway for Mattala Airport. So we're going to get a little over, maybe 1.2, 1.3 billion US dollars as non-debt creating reserves which are going to come in. So hopefully what the government might be able to do is, again, there is a little bit of space because there is no sovereign bond due for repayment this year or next. So what we want to do is to try to use this money to do some liability management to push out the tenor of some of the sovereign bonds which are coming due in successive years from 2019 onwards. For 5 years, I think except for 1 year, we have at least $1 billion that we have to pay on sovereign bonds which are becoming due. So this space that we are getting, hopefully, will also enable for us to do some liability management to address this bunching that we have coming ahead of us in terms of external debt repayment. Another benefit from this is this money, when it comes in, of course, will sit in the central bank reserves, but it will get converted and the government can use that money, I hope, to pay down debt, to pay down the domestic debt. That's an opportunity for the government. Well, the government may think it has other priorities, but I really hope that this money will be used to pay down the debt. Let me also, talk a little bit about the relationship between fiscal deficit and growth on the one hand, and fiscal deficit and equity on the other. On growth, clearly, when you have a fiscal challenge and you're compelled to have fiscal consolidation, there's an impact on public investment. Quite often, it's public investment that tends to bear the brunt of fiscal adjustment. In our case, another channel through which the fiscal challenge is going to constrain growth is we now have to increase total factor productivity. We are no longer, because of our demographics, no longer able to drive growth through labor augmentation. So it's really total factor productivity improvement that's going to drive growth to a much larger extent. And there, if we don't have the resources for the education, for the R&D, for the innovation, all that whole ecosystem, if there's no public money to basically catalyze private money to come into those areas which are important to increase total factor productivity, then our growth is also going to be constrained. Then on the equity side, clearly when you have a fiscal challenge, the scope for redistributive policies is much less. Not only that, the scope to have pro-poor development programs is also constrained. Now, India's Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee program and Brazil's Bolsa Familia programs, which are held up as examples of very successful social development programs, would not have been possible if growth didn't accelerate in those countries. Now, of course, Brazil is in some trouble, but without the acceleration of growth and the revenue boost that comes with growth, public revenue growth that comes with growth, you cannot have those kinds of programs. So really having sound fiscal outcomes is essential both in terms of driving growth forward as well as creating the space for having programs which are distributional and pro-poor in their impact. Let me now quickly turn to the remedial measures. Now, as you're well aware, fiscal reform is at the heart of the government stabilization program. And equally, revenue enhancement is at the heart of that stabilization-oriented fiscal consolidation. Now, at this point, let me say a word also about the role of the IMF. I often hear, not only in Sri Lanka, when I work for the Commonwealth in many countries, people always say, well, there is this IMF imposed austerity program that we are saddled with. And I would ask you to pose the question to yourself. Let's assume there was no IMF. Okay? There is no IMF, no Bretton Woods conference, IMF was not set up. And we are in the situation we are in today. Would we have to have a stabilization program? Would we have to have fiscal consolidation? So it's got absolutely nothing to do with the IMF. The only way the IMF comes into the picture, in my view, is that they give us a little bit of money, that helps. But more importantly, they catalyze both bilateral and other multilateral money, and more importantly at this point, they also make international capital markets more accessible to us. So what the IMF program really does is it reduces the pain associated with stabilization. If we were not able to mobilize the bilateral, multilateral and international capital market money, which is triggered by the IMF program, the squeeze on domestic absorption would be much, much greater, and the pain would be much, much greater for us to get out of this hole, which is driving us towards the kind of debt situation that Dr. Vijay Wardner was speaking about. So that, I think, is very important that we understand this is our program. IMF is helpful in making it less painful, but this is something that we need. I think I tell you owe me one now. The other, the one positive thing I should also share with you is that the IMF program is broadly on track. The government met the June target, it met the September target, and it's, I think, reasonably on target as far as for the December targets as well. And there is broadly staff level agreement so that the review can be taken up by the IMF board in the third week of November. So that's encouraging. As I said, that is important because it reduces the pain that we have to experience in putting our house into order. Now, on the revenue side, as we are moving into a budget, I'll talk in very broad terms. There's going to be a new Inland Revenue Act. The government is going to look at reducing exemptions. It wants to have a fairer and simpler tax to widen the tax base and to start this shift that the Prime Minister has spoken about of going from this 80-20 balance between direct and indirect taxes more towards the 60-40 balance. Clearly that cannot happen overnight, but hopefully this budget will launch us in that direction. There are also improvements in tax administration underway, and the key components will be the introduction of RAMIS, which is the Revenue Authority Management Information System, and decentralization of tax collection. You will hear much more of this in a much more informed way from my colleague, Assistant Governor Mahinda Siriwardena tomorrow morning. But I'm just giving you a broad brush approach, but he will give you a lot more substance and meat as to what is happening in terms of fiscal adjustment. So that's on the revenue side. And there is also an effort to control expenditure management, including adoption of new technology next year as well. But on the expenditure side, as I said, the overall level is not so much of a problem, provided we get revenue up. But there the challenge is that the focus should be on the composition of expenditure and the quality of expenditure. So we need, and in that process, we need to mainstream sustainability that Dr. Vijayawardena spoke about, and we need to mainstream social inclusion. So that's really the priority on the expenditure side. Now, the trajectory of fiscal consolidation envisaged is 5.4% of GDP this year, 4.7 next year, and ultimately 3.5 in 2020. A couple of other things related to the fiscal side that I could mention is that in the current constrained fiscal environment, the government is looking much more at PPPs, particularly BOTs. It is also looking at options for off-balance sheet financing, that is securitization, structured financing options, etc. So it's looking at all these ways of raising money to maintain the momentum of public investment in particular. On fiscal monetary coordination, the life of the central bank becomes a lot easier if the fiscal outcomes are sound. It's a lot easier to deliver low and stable nominal interest rates and a competitive and stable exchange rate if the fiscal outcomes are not pumping this excess demand into the system. So hopefully as fiscal consolidation takes place, the monetary policy and exchange rate policy can deliver those outcomes. I think it's fair to say that over the years, maybe there's been too much fiscal dominance. That there has been, and as again I think Vijay said, the central bank has accommodated expansionary fiscal policies. Now, what the current monetary board and the central bank senior staff are very keen on doing is to shift away from that, to lean against expansionary fiscal policy if that emerges, to set interest rates in a forward-looking manner within a medium-term framework. In fact, work is being done to move to flexible inflation targeting. So all that is in the works, and we hope we'll be able to have a more robust monetary policy, which, when is necessary, can act as a check on fiscal excesses as they emerge, to do it early. Now I said I was going to have taken a long time, so let me very quickly say something on the supply side. As I said, macroeconomic stabilization, the fiscal consolidation at the heart of it is an absolutely necessary condition, but not sufficient to have sustained growth. So what are some of the things? We need a new growth model. The country does not have a growth model. For the period 2010 to 2015, 2014-15, essentially, 2010 to 2014, essentially the model was foreign commercial borrowing financed public investment in infrastructure. That's what drove the growth, and the construction sector, the non-tradable sectors like construction, transport, all that drove growth around that public investment program. But clearly we have run out of headroom. We basically maxed out on our credit card. So there's no way that, there's no space with that model. We have to have a new model, and there, I think Terry spoke about it, even Vijay did. We need essentially a private sector driven growth model, and it has to have exports and FDI as key pillars. I mean, all of you know this. Some people say, okay, is this the right time for this model? We have this new mediocrity of low world growth and sluggish international trade, and you all are talking about export-led growth. Does it make sense? My answer to that is we have two very positive factors we can leverage. One is our tremendously strategic location. We are 20 miles from the fastest growing large economy in the world, and we are right in the middle of China's maritime Silk Route. And on top of that, we have excellent bilateral relations with everybody, but particularly important are the excellent bilateral relations we have with the capital surplus countries of East and Southeast Asia. With China, with Japan, with Singapore, with Korea, and some of the Southeast Asian countries as well. And that, I think, is really, if you see the government strategy, that is what they're trying to do. They're leveraging very good government-to-government relations to get investment in. Now, in those countries, unlike in the West, the government can, through a nod and a wink, encourage their companies to come and invest here. So, the Western Region Megapolis, the Colombo International Financial Center, the Hambantota development with the Chinese, the Singaporeans are doing a master plan for Trincomalee, they're going to work with the Indians and the Japanese to execute that master plan. The Japanese are doing a master plan for Kandy. You're going to have these big corridors, development corridors, with a lot of the investment coming from East Asia and probably India. East and Southeast Asia and probably India. So I've taken a lot of time, so I won't go into any more detail. But on the supply side, those are some of the things. On top of that, there's a lot of work being done on the investment climate, on trade policy, on trade facilitation, and on trade policy. A quick word, by this time next year, the balance of probability is that we could have preferential access to a market of 3 billion people. We will have preferential access to the Indian market, we'll have preferential access to the Chinese market, we will have to Singapore, and hopefully GSP Plus will be restored. So we have our location, we have educated workforce, and we get to leverage that to attract the investment in here, to drive this private sector-led, export FDI supported growth strategy. So there's every chance of doing that, but we need to execute. We need to get good macroeconomic stability. Clearly, if the country is on a headlong going towards a debt crisis, people are going to be reluctant to come. So we need to sort that out. We need to also get our education, training and skills development aligned to absorb this investment which may be coming our way. So there are lots of things that we need to do. But the prospects, the chance is out there. We probably, the best chance we've had in many, many years. We've lost a few along the way, but we need to keep going. So finally, because the story is about fiscal consolidation, let me say we've made an encouraging start. The targets have been met, despite the VAT disruption, by and large. It's a credit to the finance minister and his team that they've met the targets broadly. But we need to persist. This is only the very beginning. We've just barely taken the first step. There is much to be done, and it has to be a national project involving all stakeholders. We all need to know the gravity of the situation, the extent of the challenge, but also the magnitude of the opportunity that is out there to be grasped. Thank you.